And now I'm going to hand things over to Dolores, and Dolores is going to be talking to us about grief tonight. And she is a guidance counselor in three of the different French schools. And very excited to hear what she has to say tonight.
Hello. I call the webinar Walking with Grief because as helpers, that's exactly what we do. It is impossible for us to put ourselves in the shoes of the griever. So we walk with them and we accompany them with compassion, always, never pity. Pity is not helpful, and I'll say a little more about that later on. So my credentials, where do I come from and what do I do? The studying that I did around grief came from Psychosynthesis Pathways of Montreal, where I did a 3-year program. That is a branch of psychotherapy, if you will, that speaks of us as having many parts. We can be identified with a part at one point or another, and we have to learn to recognize those and to give them the space they deserve. And we're going to see that in grief. That's exactly what we're doing. I have a master's degree in counseling from Acadia University, where I studied grief as well, under Professor Sue Smiley. And I have training from the Grief Recovery Institute of Canada. That is based in Ottawa, but they travel across the country, and I do believe they offer their training in each of the provinces. I did my training in Moncton, and they've changed the name. They now call themselves the Grief Edutherapy Institute of Canada. And the reason why they did that is because being called grief recovery, it gave an impression that grief was something that you got over, that you just, all of a sudden it was gone. And that isn't necessarily what grief is. Grief does not necessarily have an end. Grief is transformational. So, grievers want to be heard with dignity and respect. Because grievers are at their most vulnerable. They're very, very broken, can be very broken. They really don't want pity. It's not, to them, it doesn't feel right. It's a power differential when pity is involved. And also the griever, like all of us, is simply experiencing the human condition. So, respect isn't always clear. That word, I teach it to young people and it takes a long time for young people to grasp the notion of respect, because it's fluid and it's, you can't put your finger on it. It has a definition that is all encompassing, and so hopefully by adulthood, we hope that everybody has it. Respect, but sometimes we need to take inventory and maybe remind others in a gentle way about it. So confidentiality is probably the biggest way we can respect and hold someone's experience with dignity. And it's really funny because I have a friend and I love her to pieces, but she will say to me, so-and-so told me this, and they told me not to say anything, but I'm going to tell you because I'm a counselor. And I go, whoa, the hand goes up, and I say, did you ask her permission to tell me? And she said, no, but you're okay, you're safe. And I will then say, no, it is not information from me. She confided in you, and you have to hold that for her. You can't pass that along. So creating that safe place, that safekeeping for someone else's experience. And I know that you guys know all about that. I don't even have to explain it any further. So what is grief? It is pain. It is emotional pain, but it can sometimes translate into physical pain, depending on the person. But it is a normal reaction. Yet when we're in it, it doesn't feel normal. but it is so normal. It is that normal reaction to loss or change. And we'll be talking about the different kinds of losses and change very soon. Grief can feel helpless. So the person who is grieving, I mean, the change can be so, the change can be so frequent, or not frequent, that's not the word I want to use, but the change can be so sudden. And even if you have somebody who has had a very long bout of terminal cancer, and there's been a certain preparation for the death, all of a sudden the death happens and your role has changed. You've been helping for a long time, that's no longer there. You've been worried, you know, there's all of these experiences that are no longer there. So it can leave you feeling very helpless. And it is also very isolating, because even if you had 10 people in one family, you lost a mom, those 10 kids are going to experience grief in different ways. Maybe some similarities, but definitely not the same. So feeling isolated, feeling alone. It can feel like you're going insane, like you've lost control. Grief can feel angry, and we'll get into that a little more and what to do with that. Sad, numb, hopeless, and I put etc. because I found a list of about 75 things that grief can actually feel like. Grief is a part of you. So that, for me, when I say grief is a part of you, there are, as I mentioned earlier, there are many parts to all of us. And the grief is a part of us. But when you're in the throes of grieving, it feels like that's all you are. Like there's nothing else. I'm just a big bundle of grief. I don't see the light at the end of the tunnel. I don't feel anything else but this. And so I won't do this early with a client. I won't talk about grief being a part of them early, because they're just too immersed in it. But later on, as I notice that the client has, you know, done some real work, some real soul searching, maybe has started to think of the changes that need to take place and maybe accept some of those, I might introduce the fact that grief is a part of you, so that is something that hopefully can lessen or put in perspective what grief is, but not too early. The other thing that I didn't mention about the hopelessness and the going insane, there can be a lot of anxiety when someone is grieving, a lot of fear. You know, what will happen now? You know, I've lost my partner, or I've lost a child. Like, will I ever be able to go on? So there's a lot of anxiety that could come up for the person. So, loss or change, both of those are important. Loss or change. The death of a loved one. So we've all experienced, you know, maybe losing a parent or a spouse, a friend, a sibling, a child, which is I'm going to share this with you because I think it's important for you to understand either your own experience or the experience of someone that you're accompanying. When I was at Acadia University, one of my professors, a wise man by the name of Dr. John Sumera, said in class, he was talking about the wound that never heals. So after a few minutes, I put my hand up. I said, you know what is that? I mean, as we are budding counselors, to us, there's no wound that never heals. You know, everything can heal. But he said, you know, the wound that never heals is the loss of a child. And that stayed with me, and it will always stay with me. And I am particularly cognizant of those who lose children, and the importance of support groups, and the importance of support, and what you guys are doing through this program, so critical. So anyway, that's the idea. Some people do not equate the loss of a pet as being as bad as the loss of a human. But it depends, you see. If you've had 15 dogs, or you've always tied your dogs behind the house and they never ever came in, and you might not necessarily have a bond with them, that might be one thing. And I don't want to pass judgment there, because I'm scared to do that. But if you've never had any children, and you've had a pet for, your cat for 26 years, the loss of that pet is going to be devastating to you. So it's really important for us not to judge the losses of people. So loss due to separation and divorce. I work with children, and they have a hard time navigating separation in two houses and going back and forth. And when I said earlier, some of this might trigger you, I'm thinking of this because it's very common, in our culture, it's more than 50% of the population. So I think there should be more school counselors, but that I have a vested interest in that. So loss of job. So you've lost your security, loss of identity. Your whole life you were this, and all of a sudden it's gone. Retirement. I see people neglecting to retire when they can, and I think there's some fear around letting go of that identity and the financial change. The loss of a home, fire. I think of Fort McMurray these past few weeks, and what some people are feeling there. Moving, or the empty nest when all of your children are gone. The loss of hope in a given situation, or infertility. And I did not put miscarriage there, and I'm sorry, because miscarriage definitely belongs there. And there was a time when miscarriage, it was like the baby didn't even exist, like people didn't acknowledge, that there was nothing. And we've evolved from those days, and I'm really grateful for the women and men who have to grieve such a loss. And then the loss of health, so physical or mental health. And then finally, and there are more losses. I mean, I could have made 3 pages of losses, but you get it. So someone living with a terminal illness. So you can imagine what it's like to live your life, get to a place where you get a diagnosis of something terminal, and that is the beginning of your dying. So you're still alive, grieving your own loss, the loss of your own life. I can't imagine what someone goes through when they have to sit alone with themselves and ponder what is happening to them, what is going to happen to them. Faith is a remarkable thing, but you will sit with people who don't have faith sometimes. And I'm going to give you the example of my own father. My father, I never really knew him throughout my life, but maybe 5 or 6 years before he died, I did get to know him a little bit, and while he was in the hospital dying of cancer, I went to visit him every day after school. And he was scared to death. And I asked him one day, tell me, why are you so afraid? And he said, I don't know where I'm going. It's all black on the other side. There's nothing. And he was grieving. I mean, he was really suffering this loss of lack of believing, of faith. It was so sad, you know, and I didn't quite know how to help him at the time. So I just sat there and I listened. And, you know, that's where we are. We are where we are. Like I tell the kids, when you know better, you do better. That's my big learning for the lesson for the kids in school. So about grief, it is not a choice. It happens to us as a result of. It is individual. No two people grieve the same. We have to be careful not to compare our grief and pain. And this story is funny, but it's a perfect example of this. My great aunt, she was in her 80s. She fell, broke her hip, had surgery. She was recovering, and they wheeled another old lady into her room. And the poor soul had broken her hip. And she was moaning and groaning. She was in such pain, this poor lady. And my aunt, who had the thickest French accent you could ever imagine, and she was a character, she pipes up and she says, "Huh, you think you got pain, you? I got more pain than you." Well, I just wanted to stuff a pillow down her throat. So, you know, here she was anyhow, and I tried to explain to her, like, you can't say that. Like, she, you know, you're okay now. She is not. You can't be saying that. And she told me to shut up. So I guess you do what you're told. So grief is lonely. You go through it alone. You go through it alone. A family can lose a brother. There are 4 of you. Each sibling will go through it alone. And that's why it feels so lonely. Grief is proportional to the emotional investment one has lost in the relationship. That's what determines the grief. The emotional investment one has lost in the relationship. So 2 siblings will grieve differently based on the individual relationship they had with the loved one. And nobody knows what that is but the person themselves. So with no emotional investment, there will be none to little grief. But we have to be careful because some people go inward and they won't outwardly express their grief. So we can't assume that there is none to a little grief if we're not seeing signs that we normally see. So it's an iffy thing. It's always to not judge, which is the next one. Very important to not judge grief, nor to offer advice. It's important to be in the present moment. Grief can become compound or complicated, and I have a slide on that. There are 4 categories. It's not uncommon to grieve a significant loss for a period of 3 to 5 years. However, this is individual. Personally, I grieved the loss of my marriage, which was via divorce, not death, for 6 years. But that was based on where I came from and the baggage that I carried within. So it's really different. I mean, we say that, like that came from a periodical, but we can't say for sure. Over-medicating can postpone grief. However, there are situations where it is very important for the person to be medicated. And my example of that is a friend who lost her husband about, I'd say now 30 years ago, through suicide. she just couldn't, it was too much. She couldn't hold all that. She had to go to the doctor and get some meds. And so she took that for a certain period of time, and grief has to appear. And it doesn't matter if it doesn't necessarily appear right then and there, or if it's got a bit of a mask in those moments where you don't even know if you're going to get through the day. So, you know, some people, they want to tough it out, and they can, and some people can't. And that, again, is very individual. And it's okay to experience humor while you grieve. It's okay to laugh. A friend of mine died last summer. We didn't have a funeral. We had a remembering outside in nature where he loved to be. And for as much as we cried, we laughed because we shared stories. And it is okay to do that. So it's okay for us. Sometimes we have to encourage people to allow that, because there can be some guilt, especially for us Catholics. We're good at guilt. Okay, so, and then children. I had to put in children. I could do a whole hour for children because that's who I work with the most. They can and should learn about death. Usually their first experience of death is a pet. It is important that they navigate that well, that they feel what they need to feel, and that they talk about it and draw it and whatever it is they need to do. If it's not a pet, it's grandpa. So I get a lot of young people, and this is their experience. One of my colleagues lost her son. He was 15 years old. He died of cancer. I was counseling in that school back in Nova Scotia. And the kids were coming to my office, and they were crying, and they were saying, I don't understand why his mother isn't crying. So they were really perplexed because she had lost her son, but she was not crying. She did not cry at the wake. She did not cry in school when she came in to visit. She did not cry at the funeral. And this was disturbing to them because they were crying. And they thought there's something wrong here. So I told them, each of them, I know in my heart that she has cried. She cried during the 4 years he was very, very ill. She cried at the hospital many, many times. She cried alone in her bedroom. She cries a lot. But she gets strength from you guys because you were his friends and you supported him, and you're there. She knows that you are very much there for her. So she is getting strength from that. And that happens with wakes and funerals. You will see loved ones not cry because the collective love that comes through the door, it's miraculous. It's wonderful. So I promise this. What is complicated grief? It's grief that is more difficult to resolve. There are 4 components. Exaggerated grief is excessive and disabling. Could worsen into, there's one of my mistakes, into clinical depression, anxiety, alcohol, drug abuse, post-traumatic stress disorder. So exaggerated grief would, my friend whose husband committed suicide, she would have experienced something like that where she just couldn't function without getting some help. Masked grief, the symptoms may be absent, or people will mask. They'll put on that brave face, or they'll put on that, they'll get busy. They'll just keep busy, So there are different masks that we wear when we actually mask our grief. So it's important for us to know that this may or may not be happening for someone, and to invite, with our having created a safe space, to invite the person to, to really talk about what is actually going on underneath the busyness or the mask. So chronic and prolonged grief, that's grieving beyond a considerable time. People judge that, eh? People judge that. I mean, decades ago, a woman had to wear black for an entire year. And that was a symbol of her grieving. I mean, who knows? Maybe she was kind of like, okay, he's gone, maybe, who knows where she was in her grief. But society told us, that woman is going to grieve for a period of 1 year, whether she wants to or not, and heaven forbid she go on a date wearing that black dress. And delayed grief is postponed or suppressed, so a later loss can trigger. I had a little girl back in Nova Scotia. Her mother died when she was 5 years old. At 5 years old, your psyche will protect you. And it will not allow you, like, you can't possibly imagine the grief that a child would feel if they could feel the way we feel. It would, it would be ridiculous. So the psyche has this protective mechanism in our children and sometimes in ourselves. And so this little girl, she knew that mommy had died. She could say that, my mommy died. She knew that mommy was in heaven. Someone had told her that, so she could repeat that. She could draw pictures of mommy and whatnot. But she was unable to feel what is normally, she was not unable to feel grief in much of an extent at that age. When she was in grade 5, she was 10 years old. So 5 years later, half of her life, one of her classmates lost her mom. Whammo, there it was. She was old enough and her grief was ready to be experienced. In school, I will say to teachers, if we've lost someone, I want you to identify every student in school that lost a parent. I need to know that because these students will relive, they will re-grieve based on the fresh loss. A lot of people ask, what's the difference between bereavement and grief? Well, bereavement is the actual state. It's, okay, you've experienced a loss and this is where you are. And grief is what happens as a result of the bereavement. It's passive because it just happens. It wells up within you. It's involuntary. It's there, whether you like it or not, it is there. The grief needs to be felt and it needs to be expressed. Cliches to avoid. They're no longer suffering. So it is not good for us to come upon a bereaved person or a griever and say they're no longer suffering. And I found this, I experienced this myself. When my great aunt died, her daughter was crying by the casket, and my uncle, who's a funeral director, went to her and he said, Marilyn, she's no longer suffering. And Marilyn turned around, and I almost applauded. Marilyn said, I'm crying for me, not her. So I thought that was brilliant, because exactly what you're doing, it doesn't matter where they are and that they are no longer, you're the person doing what you have to do with all of that, you know? They've lived a good life. Oh, they're in a better place. And we hear that so much. I hear it constantly at home. And people mean well. That's the other thing. People are not ill-intentioned at all when they say these things. I know how you feel. I've seen women sit down by the griever and just recall the whole story of how their own husband died. Right there at the funeral parlor. I'm going, no. Don't do that here. It's not about you. I know how you feel, so we don't know how you feel. You don't miss what you never had. That is not true. I never had a father. I didn't necessarily miss him, but I missed having a father, what I think a father is. You are still young, as if you're going to go out on a date next week. It's just an animal. Nobody better say that to me. And try to think positive. Well, you know what? When you are consumed by grief, it is really hard to think positive. It's almost impossible to think positive. And if you can, tickety-boo. But I think I might have some choice words for somebody who told me to think positive. So, what will occur as a result of this grief that people have to feel? What will happen is there will be a reorganization of the griever's life. The griever will put their lives back together in a new way. And this comes from narrative theory, the whole idea of creating a new story, restoring. And that can only happen when the griever is ready. We can't expedite that as counselors. There will be a redefining of the self without the person. A reweaving of how we engage with the world. Grief restores the psychic equilibrium. It is important work. And those of us who walk with people who grieve, it is a very important work, and we have come a long way in that. And it will be transformational. Grief is very transformational, but that can't happen too quickly. It has to, like my psychosynthesis teacher used to tell us, slow is fast. So how can you be helpful? How can we all be helpful? Your presence is critical. And I know that, you know, sometimes we're on the other end of the country and we have to do things via Zoom or Skype or FaceTime, telephone, and that is fine, and that is great. You know, I'm not discounting that or discouraging that at all. Because there were times when, boy, a friend's voice on the phone was very comforting to me. Be present if you can. Active listening, so your body posture, your eye contact, you know, truly active listening. And listen again and again. Did you ever notice that someone who's grieving, they tend to tell the same story, or they'll tell the same story but maybe with a little bit of something new? That is part of their process. That is part of their healing process. That's that telling. Paraphrasing them, you know, is what you're saying, you know, this, or is it, do I understand this right? Is this what you mean? So that paraphrasing allows them to hear themselves. So you're mirroring back to them what they are saying, feeling, etc. So it's a really important technique. Avoid the temptation to hand them a tissue. Keep a box very near. Reaching for your own tissue, there's empowerment in that. There's a taking care of myself in that. The telling of one's story helps organize and reorganize the experience. It is the process of meaning making. And they have to make meaning of what happened. At first, it's senseless. We all ask, why? Oh my goodness, makes no sense, that terrible accident, so the grieving helps in the meaning making, and it takes time. So it's important to take the time it takes. Grievers may put on masks to please others. And there is a place for writing in the grieving, a very good, important place if the person is into that. Crying is okay here. When I was a little girl, in our house, it used to be, quit that crying or I'll give you something to cry about. And even today, in school, I have little 5-year-olds, and the only way they can express themselves, their frustration and their anger, is crying. So I have teachers trying to stop them from crying. And then there's the counselor who says, let him cry. That's his little seat. Just give him the space to feel what he's feeling. And when he's done, he'll be done. Anyway, I'm not popular when I do that. But crying is so important. And sometimes, especially men, in our culture, we didn't want our little boys to cry. We were more accepting of our little girls. It's critical for our little boys to cry, and it's critical for our big boys to cry and to be allowed to, and to feel safe doing it. Anger, that's another one. Nobody likes anger. Oh, it's terrible, but it's so important. It is power. Anger is fuel. It's like putting gas in your car. So what they need to do with their anger is find safe expressions of anger. Creative outlets are wonderful for this. Now, drawing is critical. I do drawing with young people, but I know older people who draw as well, and it works for them. Writing is so important. Oh, writing that angry letter. Sometimes people die and you were mad at them. So get that out. Exercise is so important. Emotion is energy in motion. That's what it is. Emotion is energy in motion. So if you can move that grief out, no matter what exercise you choose to do, that is going to be helpful. Telling your story and being heard, crafts, etc. So a lot of people don't have rituals anymore. I don't know if you guys noticed, but where I'm from, like now a lot of people choose to be cremated and no wake. So no wake and a funeral, or maybe not. And so a lot of people do what the deceased wanted or didn't want. Well, the rituals that happen after someone took their last breath, they're not for the deceased. They're for the people who are left after, and those people need support. They need communal support. Part of the letting go is having that community come to you. Now, if you're an introvert and you really don't want that, that's okay. But I find that sometimes the loved ones, they really get left in the cold because, it just comes and goes and there's nothing, for support. So anyway, the music can be very important and can be very, it can really bring up some emotion that needs to be brought up. The eulogy, the readings, the wake, the party. I mean, if you're Irish, or throw a party. I've been to many, many funeral home parties. They're a ball. The remembering, which you can do anytime after, not just at the beginning. My grandmother died 8 years ago. Every January 30th on her birthday, all of my aunts come to my place. We have a potluck. We play her favorite game of cards. We look at pictures. We tell stories, and we laugh. And that's our remembering every year. And, you can also go to the favorite place and do what you need to do. Okay, so in a family, when you share the same loss, why do you not grieve the Because one, you're different people. Two, there were different relationships with the deceased. You're all at a different place in your life. You have different memories. You have you're in a different place in the grief process, or have different grieving styles, or different levels of support. One of you might be alone in Wisconsin, whereas someone else has a spouse and 3 kids in Newfoundland. So it really depends. And if you're going to help people with grieving, it's very important to care for yourself, because compassion fatigue can come upon us fast, and it's not good for us. So setting limits and boundaries, because it can be very demanding. Making referrals. Look, I know this counselor. Did you try Reverend Barry King? So we can make referrals. We can seek help for ourselves, for debriefing for our own selves, or counseling for ourselves. I have been a counselor for only 8 years, and let me tell you, I have had to seek a lot of support for my own work in order to not burn out. I thank you so much.